vil give ordet i dag til, det er fremtiden. Jeg vil give ordet til fremtiden. Det er jo stærkt at sige, at give ordet til fremtiden. Og jeg kom ind for alle sammen, der sker noget lige nu. Ind i teltet. Gnid søvn og øjnene og kom ind. Ja, jeg vil godt tænke mig, at der kommer lidt flere lige at høre din tale her, fordi vi har besøg af Hjemløsepræst Asser Skude, som kommer op her om lidt. Han har kommet hvert år til minoriteternes grundlovsdag og sagt noget om de hjemløse og de utilpassedes vilkår i Danmark i dag. Og det har vi været meget glade for, at Asser har været med flere gange. Så jeg tror, jeg giver dig ordet, og så håber vi, der kommer nogen og hører. I begyndelsen var ordet. Værsgo, Asser. Selv sætte den i stativet.
Tusind tak. Tak Rita, tak Christiania. Tak for invitationen. Og rigtig kæmpe meget tillykke med fødselsdagen, Christiania. Som min søn på 8 sagde til mig, da jeg fyldte 50, nu er du halvvejs mod 100. Halvvejs mod 100, det er ikke så tosset, kan jeg fortælle dig, Christiania. Du har erfaring, men du har stadig mange år i dig endnu. Og jeg håber, du bliver mindst 100 år. Og resten af Danmark vil lære mange af de ting, som du har vist os, Christiania. Kæmpe tillykke med dagen. Jeg får lov at tale lidt om fremtiden for de frie kulturelle steders muligheder for udfoldelse. Det lyder jo måske lidt tørt og langhåret, men det handler jo bund og grund om fremtiden for dem, som er udsatte. Og det ser jo ikke så godt ud måske. Fordi jeg ved jo fra min tid, hvor jeg læste om Jesus, at allerede på Jesu tid for 2000 år siden, der var det også svært at være udsat. Det var ikke noget rart sted at være lukket udenfor af dem, som har de rigtige meninger, de rigtige holdninger, og dem med magten og dem med penge. Og jeg ved, at Jesus han kæmpede i det grænseområde. Han gik om nogen de udsattes ærne. Han talte varmt for inklusion, også længe før det blev et indord. Han talte for at række ud. I ved godt, at siden Jesus, så har mange kæmpet, og nogle gange også kæmpet forgæves. Og nogle gange har præsterne og kirken endda også holdt op med at kæmpe og række ud. Også selvom det var det, de skulle gøre. Det var lidt morsomt, fordi jeg stod og talte med en af jer, Christiania, uden for teltet. Vi prøvede at få folk ind i teltet. Og han nævnte faktisk munken Frans af Assisi. Og det er ham, jeg vil tale lidt om i dag. For han levede faktisk om. Han havde ikke mere end det, han gik og stod i. Han rejste ikke kloden rundt. Han kastede ikke om sig med penge. Han spiste kun yderst beskedent og gik beskedent klædt. Og hvis man ikke vidste bedre, ville man måske tro, at han bare var en udsat. Hvis man altså havde set ham, eller set ham komme gående på gaden dengang, eller set det sted, hvor han lå og sov. Et sted, som, ja, man skulle måske tro, at han havde været hjemløs, hvis man havde set det sted. Måske kunne det være et mål for fremtiden, at ikke at kirken eller præsterne skal efterleve Frans' fattigdomsideal. Selvfølgelig skal kirken og præsterne også have mulighed for ordentlige forhold. Men målet kunne jo være, at kirken og præsterne, og jeg selv inklusive, godt kunne lære noget af ydmyghed og selvkritikken. Nemlig at ikke tage noget for givet. Altid være åben for, at Guds hus og Guds budskab og præstegerning og kirke ikke kan sættes på formel eller Excel-ark, men at budskab om kærlighed er ubetinget og kræver alt af os. Kærlighed er, som apostlen Paulus siger, at tage imod hinanden, som Herren har taget imod jer. Altså tage imod hinanden helt og udelt, uanset hvad vi kommer med, hvordan vi ser ud, hvad vi har på og spiser, og hvad vi har af holdninger. Der skal altså være uendelig højt til loftet. Det er en gave at leve, og det er en gave at være i stand til at elske og tage imod hinanden, ligesom Gud har skabt os med alt, hvad vi kommer med. Og den vending af et andet menneske, at det er din gave, ja, det er i virkeligheden sat kristendommen på en sætning. Det kan selvfølgelig være en stor opgave nogle gange, Men det er altså en gave og en velsignelse at holde det billede fast, at det vi møder på vores vej i livet, det er en gave. Når det i dag er Christianias fødselsdag, så vil jeg, fordi jeg respekterer Christianias ideal om, at der er hjerterum og plads til skæve eksistenser, så vil jeg gerne være med til at sige kæmpe tillykke. Og selvom Christiania ikke er det samme som den evige Gudsstad, den himmelske stad, så er det alligevel et forsøg på at skabe et optimalt samfund, så godt som det lader sig gøre efter menneskelige standarder. Og hatten af for det. Og ikke uden grund er Christiania verdensk berømt. Det siges jo, at der kommer flere turister her til Christiania end til noget andet sted i Danmark, selv flere end til Amalienborg, den lille havfrue. Og det tror jeg ikke er tilfældigt. Jeg tror, det er fordi de gør det af en grund. Fordi at her findes ingen andre steder i verden, som har samme frihedsgrader som her. På den måde mener jeg godt, at Danmark, resten af Danmark, herrefru Danmark, eller hvad man nu vil sige, kunne lære lidt af Christiania. Det er med, at der er plads og rummelighed. Og ikke mindst plads og rummelighed til de skæve eksistenser. Og det håber jeg selvfølgelig også kan være i fremtiden. Det ligner et budskab, jeg har hørt om kærlighed og fred mellem mennesker, hvor man ikke fordømmer eller dømmer hinanden, men elsker hinanden. Og møder hinanden som et unikt menneske skabt i Guds billede, til at modtage vores udelte opmærksomhed og kærlighed. Og det værer sig, uanset hvem det er, om det er gammel eller ung, anarkist, kommunist, borgerlig, flipper, hippie, joppie, revolutionær, konservativ, hjemløs, bolighaj, kapitalist eller socialist, liberal eller konform, og du kan selv finde på mange flere. Der skal være plads til alle, højt til loftet. Det vil jeg gerne være med til at skrive under på. Så rigtig kæmpe stor tillykke til Christiania. Tillykke med de 50, og jeg håber, at du vil blive rigtig gammel og leve længe. Og vi må lære af dig, Christiania. Giv en stor hånd til Christiania.
Tak til Asser Skude, vores hjemløsepræst, som har optaget mange gange til stor glæde for os andre på minoriteternes grundlovsdag, som vi plejer at holde herude på det her sted, faktisk selv her. Hver eneste år siden 2005, men de sidste 2 år, så har corona været der og ødelagt det hele. Så vi har haft lidt på nettet, og så er det lavet lidt sjovt her, ikke? Men det er jo ikke det samme. Men nu er vi her nu. Så nu handler det om, at Aja Waalwijk will talk about generation. Talk about my generation. The who.
But before I start with my generation of the Who, as far as I sing it, we have to wait till the computer is connected to the piano and the bass guitar. I don't know if it is a computer. But anyhow, generations are so important. Before I start my speech, I wait till indeed the instruments are ready, because I get a little bit accompanied, because after all, a symposium is also a form of happening. So let's make it all a happening and feel happy to be here. I mean, we are here to try to trespass borders, to cross borders, to make liquid border lines, not only between private property and collective property, but also in between the ages that often separate us. So my whole story is a little bit based on that problem, insofar it is. But there is a problem, because, yeah, you know, not one little baby crawling around here. It says a lot. It's not a problem, because we can still talk generations without having to be there with all generations. But anyhow, we have to be aware of a certain gap that is existing between people of different age groups. And that is where my talk will be about when the music is ready. And we still have to wait for a little cake. Anyhow, I still wait with my speech. I come from the village of Ruigoord, which has a sort of a similar development in a way as Christiania. It is very small in comparison. It was existing because of a group of artists that squatted the village. Let's say those were the most prominent, some writers, some visual artists. So we have a literary tradition in the village. We have every year a super poetry festival, which is quite unique for the free cultural space, that you have poetry festival. So that poetry festival is quite unique in the Netherlands. We also have the so-called land jewels, a meeting, because we used to have an enormous area around the village with enormous possibilities to expand, especially a festival culture. So besides being a living spot for a relative small group, it also became a festival ground for 10,000s. We had festivals there with 11,000 people. It was too much because we organized it, in between brackets, with perhaps 10 people or 5 people. Yeah? So there was no police, there was no entrance, there was no reason to pay anything. No, so you just did what you wanted to do, and it became quite... We started with poetry, of course, and then the kite festivals. So the air became part of the whole story, kites. And then from the kites to a sculpture route, because then I had the idea, make an environment out of your tent, because we were all camping there. So everybody started to make an artwork of his tent, and we made grotesque huts and whatever. Teepees started to appear. So it started very simple. We had sometimes 200 fires on the field. So in a night, half tripping, you moved from fireplace to fireplace, and they were fighting at one fireplace, and they had a political discussion at the other fireplace, or they were reading poetry at the other fireplace, or they were singing songs, or you came to a fireplace where nobody said a word. You know, so going from moment to moment, I started to appreciate this living freedom in a way that happened in those 70s, 80s, 90s. Even the Hells Angels were part of our parties. They had their own fire, they were a bit aside, but we had a good time together. They were like hippies on motorbikes in those days still. So I invited a Hare Krishna to have a counterweight, and they also came. So you had the Krishnas and the angels all together on our field. So step by step. Then the church became a culture center. We both worked on it. Huh? Yeah, it took me weeks to clean the church.
All the windows.
Yes, and then I asked Ellen, would you like to restore all the glass in the windows that was broken?
Yeah, that was 2 years every weekend, and I used to have Elena were very little, and sometimes I took her with me, but it was very cold and empty, and it was summer and winter, and sometimes I went her across the road to Gerben Hellinga. Oh, yeah. And also we fixed all the windows. I got help by one of my pupils, Nicky. He helped me in the end, and after that time it could be used as a party, and I think it became on the list for monuments, right? And since that time there's been a party in the church. And yeah, that was it.
Thank you, Ellen, for this edition. Okay. Ellen is some very important woman from Friessteden Tuurlaren, the new Samfund, which even started before Christiania. But she was also, let's say, part of the hippie scene in Amsterdam. So we met already in Paradiso, the Milky Way, Ruigoord, all these places were the places where people like us met. So we have also a shared history coming from the same generation. This is a question that ends with a question. How to arrive at a different composition of generations? Discussing generations, you can't ignore the band The Who with their song My Generation. People try to put us down, talking about my generation, just because we get around, talking about my generation. 25 years after the Second World War, a generation conflict is expressed in one sentence. People try to put us down because we just get around. These people that try to put us down represented the older generation that wanted to downsize the generation of the I figure because they get along. To get around can mean to find or take the necessary time or effort, to give attention or consideration, or to go from place to place. It is a song for baby boomers, the representatives of the post-war birth explosion that developed into youth culture. Homo ludens made its appearance, the playful man, and alternative forms of living and being together arose. Talking about my generation. Every 25 years we talk about a new generation. A division based on the average period in which people have offspring and thus pass on genes. The genes of generations. Biologically, their children are the first generation. After 25 years, we are talking about a second generation. After 50 years, the third is already on the way. This is the case in Christiania and also in Ruigoord. We are at half in 4 generations. Anyone here could be grandma or grandpa. Talking about my generation. Let's start a doomsday scenario. Pioneers of free cultural spaces create a tradition. The second generation misses the pioneer spirit, but still works on innovations. The third generation is traditionalist, and most of the time traditionalists do not innovate. The fourth generation has been overruled by surrounding forces. That's the end. But the process of coming up, flowering, corruption and or decay don't necessarily have to take place. 100 years cover 4 generations, so there is room and time to turn the doomsday scenario around. So we are half the way here. Let's swap, come up with another scenario. In addition to the classic division of 25 years, the concept of generation is also linked to decades. We are talking about the 60s generation, the 70s generation, the 80s and 90s generation, and so on. Every 10 years is equally experienced as a generational demarcation. I'm talking about generations. How do generations talk to each other? How do generations talk about each other? How do generations talk to each other? For example, there is a digital generation gap. The means of communication have changed. Children have quick contacts via mobile phones. Elderly people still write a letter or send a postcard. Can that gaps and so many others be bridged? From kindergarten we learn to live in birth cohorts. In kindergartens all the toddlers around you are 5 or 6. In high school, almost everyone in your class is of the same birth year. This is how generations are created. In tribal societies, things are more gradual. There, young children learn from older children without teachers in the Western sense of the word. There, the grandfathers and grandmothers are the babysitters, or they form a nursery. Grandmas chew the food for their children's babies. Also, words are chewed and passed on by singing songs. Even if you are 1 or 99, you share the same time. We are all contemporaries. How to get back to oral traditions? How do you bring collectives into contact with each other in an organic way? How do you transcend age groups? Generational mobilization is possible. Greta Thunberg is an example. What can we degenerate? What are we not passing on? What can we regenerate? What do we pass on? What do we generate? This is worth a discussion among all generations. How to arrive at a different conception of generations. I have the impetus here to make a time capsule. It should be ready by the end of this year to be reopened in 50 years from now. We have until the month of December to involve all generations in formulating or drawing messages to the future residents and users of Christiania. This is a way of doing something together, something to bridge generations. Talk beyond generations, talk about transgenerations, talk beyond generations, talk about transgenerations, talk about transgenerations, 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 talk beyond generations, talk beyond generations, talk about transgenerations, 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 talk beyond generations, talk about transgenerations. Thank you. And put your message to the future to bridge that generational gap. To start with today in this box, and before the end of the year, Britta, we will make a real time capsule to put all our messages inside. Thank you so much.